Part 2. I guess we're going to be talking about how other places in the world did slavery, because that's true, and children should learn that other places in the world did slavery. But also, slavery varied very much depending on where it was done and how it looked. For example, slavery in the United States today looks very different than slavery in the 1850s. But slavery exists in both contexts.
Cinderella and smallpox blankets have in common. They're all fairy tales. For decades, you've been told that you live on stolen land.
We are right now on stolen land.
That the Indians were peaceful.
Native Americans, we massacred them.
Your ancestors committed genocide.
I mean, my ancestors were living in, like, Norway and Sweden at the time, so my ancestors didn't do that. But, like, someone's ancestors certainly massacred indigenous people.
And guess what?
Also, yes, we have historical records talking about giving Native Americans smallpox blankets.
None of it is true. The Native Americans were some of the most savage fighters ever known to man. Raiding, scalping, torturing, even eating enemies. It was better to lose a battle to the U.S. Army than to get wiped out by a rival tribe. And why did the story completely change in the 1960s? It turns out there's a lot more to the American Indians than Hollywood directors and school teachers want you to know.
Oh boy. Yeah, we all really want to learn about indigenous people from this chuckle clown.
This month, we blow up the biggest myths about the American Indians and reclaim the real history that was stolen from us. This is the real history of the American Indian.
I don't know that I can watch that because it will make me... I mean, all of this makes me really mad. Maybe I have to do a series where I go through each and every one of these things that he puts up, because someone's got to do it. Someone's got to do it, and it might as well be me. I can take this burden to Mordor, I guess. God damn it.
Slavery's roots go back at least to ancient times in Babylonia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, as well as the Amerindian empires in Mexico and South America. One of the earliest references to slavery comes from this clay tablet from a Middle Eastern city called Uruk, dated back to around 3300.
Did you just call it Uruk? What's wrong with you? There's two U's there. Uruk.
BC, which gives us a look into Babylonian slavery. For example,
Uruk.
On one surface of the tablet, there's a notation showing that at least 213 people were designated by the sign combination Sal-Kur, which means female and male slave, respectively. Young slaves, and specifically infants, were considered the most valuable. Poor parents often sold their own children into slavery. The historian Amanda Podany writes in her book, Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, quote, a woman named Ku'e.
Okay, that's actually a really cool book, by the way. First good source I've seen.
Made what must have been a heartbreaking decision. She would sell her daughter. We've encountered this phenomenon before in the Ur III period, when a family had to sell a child into slavery because that was the only way that the child would be able to be fed and to live, and that the parents could survive. The price of the baby was 30 shekels. 1,000 years later, Ur-Nammu, the leader of the Sumerian dynasty of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, issued a legal code with different penalties depending on whether you were legally classified as free or a slave.
Okay.
A more famous ancient reference to slavery comes from the Code of...
Again, I do have to ask, is this entire section just other places did slavery? Because... yes, we know that. Okay, all right.
Hammurabi, which established slaves.
I mean, you can also look at the fact that Europe had slavery for a very long time too, and abolished it in like the 1800s.
As property, set rules for interactions between slaves and their owners, included penalties for harboring fugitive slaves, and had class-based punishments for crimes based on whether the perpetrator was free or slave. Slavery was so common in ancient Greece that most classical scholars agree that Plato simply assumed that there would be non-Greek slaves in the ideal city in the Republic, In Aristotle's Politics, he openly declared, quote, "Some men are by nature free and others slaves, and that for these latter slavery is both expedient and right."
Yeah. Because, sometimes the ancient Greeks were wrong about stuff. They thought eels came out of mud in the ground.
Indeed, in ancient Athens, slaves comprised more than 35% of the population. Athenian slaves were private property and could be bought and sold. Slaves who worked domestic jobs or skilled crafts had a decent shot at acquiring freedom, but there were also slaves who were sent to the mines. They were leg-ironed, routinely starved, savagely beaten, seldom saw daylight, and were worked to death with a typical life expectancy of about 4 years. Athens, by the way, was the best place to be a slave in the ancient world. In Sparta, slaves known as helots outnumbered citizens 7-1. And one thing that made them unusual is that they were public, not private property. But because they vastly outnumbered citizens, Sparta used brutal secret police to intimidate the slaves and gave the secret police power to execute slaves who seemed strong or rebellious. Sparta was a total apartheid state and banned helots from using the same roads as Spartan citizens. Every year, Sparta's leaders would declare war on the slaves.
It's really interesting that Matt Walsh can identify an apartheid state in the form of Sparta, but not necessarily apartheid states in modern day. Like, Matt Walsh's perfect society would be effectively an apartheid state like this, but on the basis of, white skin and black skin.
Killing them was not considered homicide. In the late stages of the Roman Republic, there were an estimated 2 to 3 million slaves, including roughly a third of the population of Rome. Roman slaves were chattel, the full property of their owners. Some worked in agricultural chain gangs. The punishment for runaways was often crucifixion. After a slave rebellion in 71 BC, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus crucified 6,000 slaves on the road from Capua to Rome, a dead slave mounted to a cross every 100 feet or so. The word slavery itself provides some insight into just how ubiquitous slavery has been throughout history. Slave comes directly from the ethnic term Slav, because the people who lived in Central and Eastern Europe, Slavic peoples, were so frequently captured and sold into slavery from the 8th to 11th centuries. Slavery was widespread outside of Europe too, of course, according to the anthropologist Pierre van den.
Just to go back slightly, worth noting that Marcus Licinius Crassus was also historically, I believe, the richest man that has ever existed. I might be wrong about that. Let me just double check that real quick. I believe he is the one who owned the privatized firefighting service in Rome. Was he not the richest guy ever? I really thought he was. Like, if you adjusted for inflation. Like, he died with the net worth of 170 million sesterces, which is roughly, if, just to make an equivalent to the United States real quick, roughly, annual budget of the United States. How much money would that be? Okay, the average, okay, to put it into context here, the average annual budget of the United States is over $7 trillion. When Crassus died, he died with a net worth equal to the annual operating budget of the entire Roman Empire, which was significant, as one might imagine the Roman Empire's annual budget to be. To put it into perspective, it would be like a man dying today worth $7 trillion. Now, Mansa Musa probably might have had more material wealth. Net worth adjusted for inflation. Okay, Mansa Musa adjusted for inflation would have been worth an estimated $400 billion, which that's a lot, but we're talking like Elon Musk wealth. It could have been as high as 600 billion. It was still the Roman Republic back then. I mean, Crassus was one of the leading reasons it did not stay the Roman Republic. Like, Crassus was the patron of Julius Caesar. I think by the time he died, it was the Empire. Sorry, this is just interesting to me. It's not relevant to the wider video. Let's move on.
Berg, war captives and slaves were systematically humiliated and often tortured to death in some North American Indian societies. Among some South American groups of the Amazon rainforest, slaves were well-fed, but only in preparation for a cannibalistic feast preceded by a mock battle in which the slave would be clubbed to death. Often slavery was a simple function of power dynamics. As countries rose and fell, they'd shift from enslavers to the enslaved. Consider the case of the Irish in the early 5th century. As the power of Rome declined, Irish marauders frequently raided the British coast for loot and slaves. Thousands of men, women, and children were taken. In one raid on the village of Bonavem Tabernier near modern-day Wales, Irish raiders kidnapped a 16-year-old boy named Succat. Succat spent 6 years as a slave at a sheep farm in Northern Ireland. He later escaped, returned home, became a priest, and came back to the land of his captivity as a missionary. And we know him today as St. Patrick, patron saint of Ireland. By 795 AD, the tides had turned, and now Vikings were enslaving the Irish.
Now, this is true. I hope that he's going to talk about the Viking slave trade because, it's difficult to talk about the prevalence of slavery as a system without talking about the Vikings, right? Like, the Vikings, at one point, I believe, like, a third of their population was made up of slaves. Yeah, here's a Smithsonian piece about it that I found a while back. Let's see here. One of the most enduring components of the Viking image is the notion of freedom, the adventure of a far horizon, and all that went with it. But for many, this was an unattainable hope. Any true reading of life in the Viking Age first has to come to terms with an aspect of everyday experience that probably represented the most elemental division in societies at the time, the difference between those who were free and those who were not. Beneath the social network, any other distinction of class, status, property, and wealth pales beside the most basic fact of liberty and the consequent potential for choice. The institution of slavery had long antecedents in Scandinavia, probably going back thousands of years before the time of the Vikings. By the 8th century AD, a considerable portion of the unfree people lived in the north, their condition largely a hereditary one built up over generations. In the Viking Age, this picture changed dramatically because for the first time, Scandinavians began to make the active acquisition of human chattel a key part of their economy. This was one of the primary objectives of Viking raids and military campaigns, and the result was a massive increase in the number of enslaved people in Scandinavia. Let it therefore be clearly stated, the Vikings were slavers, and the kidnapping, sale, and forced exploitation of human beings was always a central pillar of their culture. True! The slave could own nothing, inherit nothing, leave nothing. They were not paid, of course, but in some circumstances they were allowed to retain a small portion of the proceeds they obtained at market when selling goods for their owners. As a result, it was technically possible, though rare, for a thrall to purchase his or her freedom. They could be manumitted or released from slavery at any time. Based on these parameters, some scholars have argued that the number of actual enslaved people in the Viking Age society was relatively low. But as researchers conduct additional analysis of detailed European records or of Viking slave-taking raids, the scale of this trade has been revised sharply upward. Yeah, it's interesting stuff, to say the least. A tiny handful of texts preserve the actual voices of the enslaved. One is an 11th century highly decorated runestone from Hovgarden, the royal estate on Adelsö Island in Lake Mälaren, Sweden. The inscription honors the king's estate manager and is a rare example of people erecting a stone to themselves while alive. Read these runes. They were properly ordered, cut by Tollir, the Briti of Roden, appointed by the king. Tollir and Gaila had them cut, husband and wife, to their own memory. Haakon did the carving. Just interesting stuff here. But like, a lot of folks don't think of Europeans pre the transatlantic slave trade as like, oh, the Vikings, they just stole stuff, didn't they? Like, no, they were taking people. They were doing the enslavement. And I do want to bring this up because Matt Walsh is going to be talking about a different group of slavers, and it's pretty interesting to say the least. Well, maybe he talks a bit about the Vikings. Let's see.
Along with many other Northern Europeans, Viking slaves were seen as cattle or as advanced domestic animals who typically lived in the darkest end of the longhouse with the other domestic animals. After Oliver Cromwell conquered Ireland in the mid-17th century, the situation reversed and the Irish were at the mercy of their former captives. The new English regime forced the relocation of roughly 80,000 Irish men, women, and children to sugar colonies in the Caribbean, where they were held in bondage and forced to work in the fields. Not easy to do with an Irish complexion, by the way. Most of us have no idea.
Oh, interestingly, here's an article from Science. Historical sources make it clear that the Vikings were taking, transporting, and selling slaves, Raffield said in his talk. He estimates that slaves comprised as much as 25% of Scandinavia's population. Norse sagas mention slaves, thralls in Old Norse, who were often given pejorative names like stinky, lumpy, and stupid. But compelling archaeological evidence has been elusive. Iron manacles and collars hint at slavery, but might have been used for prisoners or dogs. Raffield plans to search for evidence of special vessels designed to carry captives. I mean, I don't think you need specialized vessels to carry captives when you have a Viking longship.
What phytonutrients actually are, but thankfully, our sponsor, Balance of Nature, understands the importance.
Little late to comment. It only became the empire after Caesar died. Oh, you're right. Thank you. I disgust myself sometimes. Thank you for the correction.
Of them. Phytonutrients are naturally occurring plant nutrients in whole foods that actually give fruits and vegetables their color, taste, and smell. If you're eating something with vibrant color and real flavor, that's a pretty good sign you're getting genuine phytonutrients.
Oh yeah, Matt Walsh. This looks like a guy who really cares about phytonutrients.
This is the town of Baltimore in County Cork, Ireland. The tranquility of its rocky shoreline was shattered on the night of June 20th, 1631. That evening at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, Islamic pirates led by a commander named Morat the Younger arrived banging war drums and screaming in Arabic. They arrived on two large...
So far, this doesn't seem to be the real history of slavery. This just seems to be an overview of different societies that have done slavery in the past, which is fine, but this isn't like a real history of slavery. You're just kind of cherry-picking different stories about slavers. This doesn't really seem comprehensive at all.
Large raiding vessels flying
it's
crescent moon
Islamophobia
flags,
time, exactly.
one 300-ton flagship equipped with 200 men and 24 pieces of ordnance, including 12 cannons on each side, and a smaller, more maneuverable 100-ton ship with 6 iron guns on each side. It came as a shock to the Irish villagers, who were mostly fishermen. According to a book called The Stolen Village, quote, none of these untraveled fisher folk would ever have seen anything like the Turkish warriors with their flashing scimitars, their swirling, flowing robes with distinctive cowls, the torchlight glistening on the sweat of bare arms, which they contemptuously left unprotected by armor. Storm them, my brave ones.
I'm pretty sure peasants in Ireland would have seen sweaty bare arms before. I have that feeling.
Some of the Janissaries would have been yelling, while others responded with shouts of Allah, Allah. These pirates were Janissaries, and they were raised from a young age to become fearsome monk-like fighters for the Ottoman Empire. Their story offers a good look into the proliferation of slavery. The forced levy of Christians to become Janissaries is called the Devshir Meh system, and it involved the kidnapping of hundreds of thousands of Christian boys over the 300 years that it was in place. After they were kidnapped, they were forcibly converted to Islam. They were extraordinarily disciplined and well-equipped. They carried muskets and pistols, carried in a red scarf tied around their waist, as well as their signature double-curved blades. The Janissaries had spent weeks sailing to Baltimore.
Why does he say it weird? Janissary. Janissaries. It's not... Okay.
Baltimore from Algiers, 1,200 miles away, preparing silently for precisely this moment. And when that moment arrived, the Janissaries were prepared. The villagers were not. Outnumbered 10-1, the citizens of Baltimore never stood a chance. Neither did the British Navy, which was responsible for patrolling the coast and protecting villages like Baltimore from attack. The British knew through good intelligence gathering in Algiers that the Janissaries were planning an attack, but expected it to happen at a much larger and wealthier town called Kinsale, 50 miles away. Through a captured and likely tortured fisherman, the Janissaries learned that the British fleet had left Baltimore unguarded, and they planned to move into the interior of the country to collect more Irish slaves. But Irish...
What's wild to me is that Matt Walsh is using the example of Irish, like a raid on the Irish coast, right? That's weird to me because, again, the Ottoman Empire was, nowhere near Ireland. Typically, Janissaries were recruited from, people who were closer to the Ottoman Empire. In this case, largely the Balkans. Like, you would have taken people that were closer to you. And, like, he's right that they often took young Christian boys and then they would mold them into, like, elite Islamic fighters, but this was largely done out of, like, a necessity for essentially troops. They would essentially try and brainwash these children and silo them into a life of military preparedness in order for them to essentially be sent out and quash any rebellion in the places that they had been stolen from. They were considered like the most loyal and the most well-trained, and they were designed to be able to grow as the Ottoman Empire expand. So the system was there to continuously recruit. When he's talking about it, he makes it sound like, oh, well, they're like looking for the Christian boys, and like it wasn't so much that they were looking for the Christian boys so much as they were taking children that they could then turn into useful weapons of the state and basically induct them into a cult-like dedication to warfare. I don't know. There's like a lot of interesting things about Janissaries. Wait, Janissary pirates, but Janissaries were an official part of the Ottoman Empire? I know! Now, I don't think it's impossible that, like, a ship of Janissaries could go to Ireland, but, actually, let's interrogate that claim. Janissaries, Ireland. Just out of curiosity. I am not finding a lot about this, to be completely honest with you. Did he make this up? Stolen Village, Baltimore and the Barbary Pirates. Okay. Des Ecken is a man who tells this story with the great verve and narrative flair of a journalist. In 1631, a Dutch renegade called Morat Reis sailed to the south coast of Ireland. One night, he landed outside the small village of Baltimore in County Cork, and he kidnapped 107 Protestant settlers and took them back to Algeria and sold them. At the time, Ireland was considered to be a nest of pirates. The Irish were sympathetic to the Barbary pirates because they were anti-English and paid well. In the 17th century, there were alehouses on the west coast of Ireland where you got to your change in Algerian dollars. There was that much commerce going on. In the story, there is some controversy about what made Morat choose Baltimore. Some say he was going for a richer town up the coast, but was put off because it was so heavily armed. The idea is that Morat captured someone who gave him this inside information and pointed him towards Baltimore because they were Protestants and the informer was a Catholic. So, Morat Reis is Dutch and not a Janissary. Let's just look this up real quick. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about this Wikipedia entry, shall we? So, Janzun van Haarlem, commonly known as Reis Morad the Younger, was a Dutch pirate who later became a Barbary Corsair in the Regency of Algiers and the Republic of Saleh. After being captured by Algerian Corsairs off of Lanzarote in 1618, he converted to Islam and changed his name to Murad. He became one of the most famous 17th century Barbary Corsairs. Together with the Corsairs, he helped establish the independent Republic of Saleh at the city of that name, serving as the first president and commander. Okay. notable raids. Having sailed for 2 months with little to show for the voyage, Janzun turned to a captive taken on the voyage, a Roman Catholic named John Hackett, for information on where a profitable raid could be made. The English Puritan residents of Baltimore, a small town in West Cork, Ireland, were resented by local Gaels because they were settled on lands confiscated from the Clan O'Driscoll, and far more importantly, they had ceased paying black rent in return for living on Clan territory. Hackett directed Janzun towards the town and away from his own. Janzun ransacked Baltimore on the 20th of June, 1631, seizing little property but taking 108 captives whom he sold as slaves in North Africa. Janzun was said to have released the Irish and taken only English captives. Shortly after the sack, Hackett was arrested and hanged for this crime. Okay, so literally nothing to do with Janissaries. I think he thought it was Janissaries because of the name Janzun, but not a Janissary. Like he was working for the Barbary Corsairs, not the Ottoman Empire as a Oh god, this is so stupid. All right. I'm really glad we paused and took another look at this claim. Oh, okay, in the wiki it later mentions Jan had Janissaries in his crew when he fought the Venetians, but he might not have had Janissaries in his crew when he raided this town. Okay, let's...
And Villa are more maneuverable, and 24 pieces of ordnance, including 12 cannons on each side and a smaller, more maneuverable 100-ton ship with 6 iron guns on each side. It came as a shock to the Irish villagers, who were mostly fishermen. According to a book called The Stolen Village, quote, none of these untraveled fisher folk would ever have seen anything like the Turkish warriors with their flashing scimitars, their swirling, flowing robes with distinctive cowls, the torchlight.
It's just a little bit, it just kind of undercuts his story when, like, the guy who's leading this raid is Dutch, you know?
Glistening on the sweat of bare arms, which they contemptuously left unprotected by armor. Storm them, my brave ones, some of the Janissaries would have been yelling, while others responded with shouts of Allah, Allah. These pirates were Janissaries, and they were raised from a young age to...
Okay. No.
become fearsome monk-like fighters for the Ottoman Empire. Their story offers a good look into the proliferation of slavery. The forced levy of Christians to become Janissaries is called the Devshir Meh system, and it involved the kidnapping of hundreds of thousands of Christian boys over the 300 years that it was in place. After they were kidnapped, they were forcibly converted to Islam. They were extraordinarily disciplined and well-equipped. They carried muskets and pistols, carried in a red scarf tied around their waist, as well as their signature double-curved blades. The Janissaries had spent weeks sailing to Baltimore from Algiers, 1,200 miles away, preparing silently for precisely this moment. And when that moment arrived, the Janissaries were prepared. The villagers were not. Outnumbered 10 to...
Also, just to be very clear, Reis Morad was not at any point a Janissary. Just to be clear. Also, just looking at some of his history here, just a brief look, we're doing it live. Dude was captured by Barbary Corsairs, right? Was, made the conversion to Islam. And then it seems like he really genuinely believed it because he tried to convert others to Islam. And then essentially took up sailing with Suleiman Reis, also known as Slayman Reis, who was also a Dutchman named Devienboer, whom Janzun had known before his capture and who had also converted to Islam. They were accompanied by Simon de Danzer. But because Algiers had concluded peace with several European nations, it was no longer a suitable port from which to sell captured ships or their cargo. So after Suleiman Reis was killed by a cannonball in 1619, Janzun moved to the ancient port of Saleh, began operating from it as a Barbary Corsair. So, not, in fact, a bunch of not in fact a bunch of like Turkish men. It's literally just it's a bunch of Dutch guys.
The citizens of Baltimore never stood a chance. Neither did the British Navy, which was responsible for patrolling the coast and protecting villages like Baltimore from attack. The British knew through good intelligence gathering in Algiers that the Janissaries were planning an attack, but expected it to happen at a much...
Again, when Matt Walsh is talking about the Janissaries as if they're a formalized part of the Ottoman Empire, it's crazy. Also, the actual history is so much cooler. I want to buy a book or like go to the library and like learn more about the Barbary pirates. That is a blank spot in my education. I'd love to fill it in because like that's just cool. That's just like interesting stories about interesting folks. Doing, sometimes cool and sometimes deeply uncool shit. But like Matt Walsh just shits all over it, It's so I mean, it's not disappointing because to be disappointed would to imply that I had any faith that he would, cover this intellectually honestly. But like I'm hooked.
Larger and wealthier town called Kinsale, 50 miles away. Through a captured and likely tortured fisherman, the Janissaries learned that the British fleet had left Baltimore unguarded, and they planned to move into the interior of the country to collect more Irish slaves. But Irish ingenuity...
That does not at all track with the actual story that we know about these pirates raiding this particular town.
Claimed the day. Resourceful villagers gathered nearby, collected firearms and rum, and started making as much noise as possible. This convinced the pirates that an English army was marching on them, and they retreated from Baltimore, limiting themselves to around 100 slaves. The raid on Baltimore is unique because of where it happened, but such raids into Europe were fairly common. In 1627, for example, Corsairs took 5 ships in a raid on remote Heimaey Island in Iceland. With total ferocity, they killed...
I'm sorry, just real quick. Are you talking about another raid from the same guy? In 1627, Janzun used a Danish slave, most likely a crew member captured on a Danish ship taken as a pirate prize, to pilot him and his men to Iceland. There they raided the fishing village of Grindavik. Their takings were some salted fish and a few hides.
Dutch converts to Islam became pirates when the country they privateered for made peace with its neighbors. And the main reason he sacked Baltimore was Christian rivalry.
Yeah, that does seem to be the case, yes. The raid was known in Iceland as the Tyrkjaranid. Wait, Tyrkjaranid. The Turkish abduction, as the Barbary states were nominally a part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, but they weren't at all formally Janissaries. Let's be clear about that. Also, this raid took place 4 years prior to the Baltimore raid, if it's the same one.
Made on remote Heimaey Island in Iceland. With total ferocity, they killed and maimed, they raped the women and girls, dismembered infants, desecrated churches, and slaughtered a priest at prayer. They burned and looted everything in sight, and, quote, settled down to a long, unhurried orgy of rape, mutilation, and murder, which seems to have been motivated by nothing more than sadistic sport. One account tells of the Corsairs cutting people in half and callously snapping the necks of infants. Anyone unable to keep up with their pace was cut down, and in their madness for blood, these villains then chopped and hacked the bodies into small pieces with the greatest enjoyment and lust for blood, wrote one eyewitness. In that particular raid on Iceland, the Corsairs kidnapped half the island's population. They murdered 1 in 12 villagers, including several priests. All in all, they returned to Algiers.
Which island was this, out of curiosity?
Because of where it happened, but such ships in a raid on remote Heimaey Island in Iceland.
1627, Heimaey Island. Is it the same one? It's the same year. Where's Grindavik? No, okay, it's the same. It's literally the same raid. Okay, they attacked Grindavik and Heimaey. Many heroic stories were told of the people who survived the invasion, most notably Gudridur Simonardóttir, better known as Tyrkja. She was taken by the pirates from her home at Stockgerdy on Hymenae to the slave market in Algeria. She was eventually ransomed back to Denmark by King Christian IV of Denmark, re-educated, and later married the poet Hallgrímur Pétursson. Yeah, this appears to be the same raid talked about in this account of Janzun, the pirate. The ships then attempted to attack the seat of the Danish governor in Iceland. Two Corsair ships from Algiers, possibly connected to Janzun's raid, came to Iceland on the 4th of July and plundered there. They then sailed to Vestamaar off the coast and raided there for 3 days. Oh, this is the raid. Okay, so during this same raid, possibly 2 other ships, completely disconnected or possibly related, showed up. Accounts by enslaved Icelanders who spent time on the Corsair ships claimed that the conditions for women and children were normal, and that they were permitted to move throughout the ship except to the quarterdeck. The pirates were seen giving extra food to the children from their own private stashes. A woman who gave birth on board a ship was treated with dignity and afforded privacy and clothing by the pirates. The men were put in the hold of the ships and had their chains removed once the ship was far enough away from land. Despite popular claims about the treatment of captives, Icelander accounts do not mention that slaves were raped on the voyage itself. However, Gudridur Simonardóttir, one of the few captives to later return to Iceland, was sold into sex slavery as a concubine. The fate of the captives was quite dim, as many of the 100 perished from disease or injury either before or shortly after arriving in Africa. With all being sold into slavery upon arrival, many of whom suffered under brutal conditions, it was estimated that less than 50 ever regained their freedom. It's interesting to compare the narratives that are emerging here as we look at this and as we evaluate Matt Walsh's version of events.
With total ferocity, they killed and maimed, they raped the women and girls, dismembered infants, desecrated churches, and slaughtered a priest at prayer. They burned and...
Also, typically churches were desecrated largely because that's where a lot of the valuables were kept. That's where a lot of the money was. They didn't have banks necessarily in a lot of these coastal towns, and the church was basically the closest thing you could get to a bank. You went to where the gold was, and the most gold was typically in the church.
Looted everything in sight, and, quote, settled down to a long, unhurried orgy of rape, mutilation, and murder, which seems to have been motivated by nothing more than sadistic sport. One account tells of the Corsairs cutting people in half and callously snapping the necks of infants. Anyone unable to keep up with their pace was cut down, and in their madness for blood, these villains then chopped and hacked the bodies into small pieces with the greatest enjoyment and lust for blood, wrote one eyewitness. In that particular raid on Iceland, the Corsairs kidnapped half the island's population. They murdered 1 in 12 villagers, including several priests.
Again, Daskin is a fucking hack. I'm kind of picking that up from the differences between some of the things we're looking at.
All in all, they returned to Algiers with roughly 400 slaves taken from the coast of Iceland. And along the way, they would seize church bells and attach them to the masts of their ships as trophies. They destroyed crucifixes and mocked Christians by destroying the Eucharist at every opportunity. According to the book, The Forgotten Slave Trade, historian Simon Webb described this shocking contemporaneous account. Quote, they began to set fire to the houses. There was a woman there, could not walk, whom they had captured easily. Her they threw on the fire, along with her 2-year-old baby. When she and the poor child screamed and called...
What is exactly the purpose of this? That humans have been awful to each other in many other places around the world?
Called to God for help, the wicked Turks bellowed with laughter. They struck both child and mother with the sharp points of their spears, forcing them into the fire, and even stabbed fiercely at the poor, burning bodies. In just 7 days, the historian Des Ecken writes, the typical medium-sized Corsair ship usually seized 5 vessels, enslaved nearly 100 Englishmen, and stole roughly 60,000 pounds. Victims who weren't killed, in many cases, became galley slaves. Since the Roman era, galley slaves were considered the most effective way to keep the galleys moving since they required coordinated rowing. If anyone took a break, they'd make the ship much less efficient. Webb notes that after a naval battle in 1571 between the Ottoman Empire and the Holy League, which included Spain and Venice, it became evident just how many Christians had been forced to row boats for the Ottomans and what horrific conditions these galley slaves had to endure. Following the battle, the Holy League discovered that more than 12,000
Also, as far as I can tell, Des Ecken is not a historian. Like, his background is in journalism, which, like, that's fine, but it could very well be that some of his sources were not as properly vetted as one might like.
European Christians had been forced to row the galleys for the Ottomans. They were shackled 24 hours a day. They were not afforded the opportunity to lie down to sleep, not that there was any room to do so in any event. Webb writes that, quote, a typical galley might have 25 oars on each side and perhaps 3 to 5 rowers for each oar. The slaves were shackled in place and were therefore physically unable to move from their designated positions. It was said in the 16th century that a galley crewed by slaves could be smelled from as far away as a mile. This was unlikely to be an exaggeration. Imagine, if you will, hundreds of men confined in a narrow space and compelled by nature to open their bladders and bowels where they were seated, day in and day out, for years at a time. There was no provision for washing. The only prospect of escape for the Ottoman galley slaves was if ships of a Christian nation defeated the Ottomans. A more dreadful fate is difficult to imagine. But not all slaves were forced to row the galleys. After returning to Algiers, some slaves, men, women, and children, were put up for the auction. Children as young as 12 years old were sold as concubines. In a normal auction, children younger than 7 could sell for over 100 pounds, roughly double the asking price for an attractive woman. Between 1500 and 1800 AD, the Ottomans and their North African corsairs, also called Barbary pirates, likely enslaved roughly 1.5 million people from Christian Europe. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which was driven by pure profit, the Barbary raids on Europe were motivated by bloodlust and hatred. One historian
They were looking to obtain material wealth. Like, that's why pirates did piracy. They were looking to steal stuff. Some Barbary pirates might indeed have been hateful. That's not unheard of. But, like, a lot of them were stealing things in order to gain wealth, gain status, gain prominence. For example, Janzun literally rose to be the first president of the Republic of Saleh, founded on the wealth that he got and prominence that he got as a Barbary pirate. Like, you could, like, it might have been pre-capitalism, but you could still accumulate capital. You know, you could still accumulate wealth and power and use that to do things. It's not complicated.
and described it as revenge, almost a jihad for the expulsion of Muslims from Spain in 1492, for the centuries of crusading violence that had preceded them, and for the ongoing religious struggle between Christians and Muslims. In the first half of the 17th century, Barbary slavers were sailing through the English Channel and into the Thames estuary, plundering local shipping and coastal towns, such that, as the minutes of Parliament put it, the fishermen are afraid to put to sea. We're forced to keep continual watch on all our coasts. By 1640, at least 3,000 British nationals were enslaved in Algiers alone. In just the 7-year stretch from 1609 to 1616, 466 English ships were.
Just as an FYI, it's worth noting that a number of the sources that he's been citing have been popularized in recent years in alt-right circles, far-right white nationalist circles, I should say. For example, that book he just quoted is by Robert Davis called Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters. And a lot of that book is essentially boiling it all down to as if it's a colossal, gigantic religious war. As if the only thing motivating all the actors in any of these circumstances is religion, which is not at all the case. when you actually look at the narratives and when you actually look at, how people behaved, how they talked to each other, how it was recorded in history, etc. And also, I believe that there is some tendency here in what Matt Walsh is citing in order to rely solely on European narratives, as opposed to looking at equally present and real narratives written and composed by, like, Barbary pirates themselves or officials in the Ottoman Empire. There are many historical records to look at here. It's not just Europe, European Christendom. It's not as if they're the only people recording anything. And also, there's a whole lot happening here. And I feel like Matt Walsh is ignoring a huge portion of how this actually would have worked and a colossally large perspective for what was happening.
Quote, boarded and the crews taken to North Africa as slaves. In April 1625, 3 ships from Cornwall and one...
Oh, another book from Simon Webb. Simon Webb. So, in Googling Simon Webb, I found this article titled The Routledge International Handbook on Decolonizing Justice, which I can tell just from the title alone is going to make a certain segment of people very angry. But let's just take a look at this particular part. In November 2021, 3 white British criminologists associated with the current of critical criminology, to which they refer as ultra-realist, published a critical assessment of the Black Lives Matter movement in Britain in the inaugural edition of the Journal of Contemporary Crime, Harm, and Ethics. Intemperate and indulgent of weak scholarship, narrow and partisan in content, it serves as a convenient exemplar of tendencies in white criminology in the UK. It displays the characteristic resentments, projections, and acquired indignant performative ignorance of whiteness. It includes a superficial and selective dismissal of critical race theory, the customary false accusations of the neglect of social class analysis, and the charge of inadequate theorization of neoliberalism. Goodness. Typical of its confusions and insecurities is the customary preemptive defense that some CRT scholars may dismiss our arguments because we are 3 white male academics, a practice they rebut with the assertion our ethnic background is irrelevant, adding, lest they be misunderstood, that they surely embody Martin Luther King's assertion that we ought to focus on the content of one's character, not the color of their skin. Discussing slavery, they echo approvingly the conservative government's discredited report on race in the UK that claimed slavery had the under-recognized benefit of demonstrating the enormous resilience of Black communities. The authors accuse BLM of neglecting wider histories of enslavement and ignoring evidence that white Europeans were taken to Africa to be sold as slaves. Their account deploys neo-fascist myths of equivalence and Islamophobic accounts that protest the European experience of slavery has been almost forgotten today because Barbary Coast Corsairs also enslaved white Europeans to sell in slave markets in the Middle East. The citation used to support this feverishly repeated theme is a contrarian journalist, Simon Webb, whose book, The Forgotten Slave Trade, is listed in the references without its full inflammatory title, The White European Slaves of Islam. The authors claim their approach is popular and enjoys growing support among the increasing number of criminology students in their universities, but other approaches are possible that depend less on the energetic erection of and clumsy demolition of flimsy straw figures. That is the source, by the way, that Matt Walsh is using, or at least he's using one of similar quality. I know that I noticed earlier he did reference that exact book, and at this point he is referencing again Simon Webb, History Debunked. Cool stuff. I wonder, just real out of curiosity, History Debunked, Simon Webb. This appears to be a YouTube channel? Is it not? Oh, it's a YouTube channel. Is this what Matt Walsh based his entire thing on? Oh my god. How Black people steal white history. Oh my god. Oh no. Oh, wow. Wow. I just out of curiosity, I gotta know.
Hello again. That a huge number of immigrants from Africa and Asia are flooding Europe is, I think, beyond dispute. That many of them have as their ultimate destination this country is also, I suppose, something most of us would also accept as being true. The flotsam and jetsam camped on the beaches of northern France testify to the veracity of that belief. Whether all this is happening by accident or design is a question I would like to address this afternoon. Before doing so, I would like to make a general observation, which is that we far prefer it if our misfortunes can be seen to have a clear and readily identifiable cause. If we develop lung cancer and are heavy smokers, then that makes sense. If, on the other hand, we are non-smoking teetotal vegetarians and find that we have lung cancer, this appears to be against nature. We don't like it. There is no cause and effect, and the random nature of the thing is disturbing. We like to know that when things happen, they happen for a reason. We hope that there is an explanation, and in the case of mass immigration, we would like to see a clear-cut explanation for what is happening, rather than assume
Oh
that the whole
boy.
business is just one of those weird geopolitical blips which occur from time to time for no particular reason. This is simply human nature. It is also, unfortunately, human nature that when a war, famine, plague, or
Okay, I think he might be trying to say Jewish people are not behind mass immigration. I'm gonna give him the benefit of the doubt because I don't want to spend another second watching this guy. But I think it is telling that he's cultivated an audience of people who are just saying, "Nah, man, it's the Jews. The Jews did it. The Jews are doing the mass immigration. They're the ones behind it." And I think he might just be racist. Here's a 2.5 minute one. Okay.
hello again. I'm sure that we are most of us aware that any publicly disseminated poster or film warning against antisocial behaviour such as theft, harassing women, hacking people, and so on, always portrays the perpetrators as being white men. This is so familiar that it has been the subject of many humorous comments, not least on this channel. From looking at posters at tube stations in London, you would think that only white men ever pestered women, stole mobiles, planted bombs, or made a nuisance of themselves in other ways on tube trains and buses. This is, of course, despite the fact that white men are now a minority in London. A while ago, Transport for London made a new film, short clips of which were released as advertisements on Facebook, showing men molesting women. Most of the men were white, but one clip of film showed a white man and a black man working together to cause discomfort to a young woman. The Advertising Standard Authority has now ruled that this was unacceptable because, in their words, it featured a harmful stereotype, was irresponsible and likely to cause serious offence. In other words, the Advertising Standards Authority sees nothing at all wrong with advertisements of this kind showing white men behaving badly, but it's now ruled that this may not be done for black men. Seriously, I wonder if anybody living in London really believes that black men never make a nuisance of themselves or steal things on
Holy
tube
shit.
trains or buses, and that they've never harassed women. Is that really plausible? I don't think so.
History debunked. Boom. That's what, yeah, you can trust this guy for his historical takes. No biases whatsoever. Oh my god. This is the guy who's writing the source that is being used in Matt Walsh's video. And I'm pretty sure this source, History Debunked, is just this guy's YouTube channel. Oh, my goodness.
Sailing from Dartmouth in Devon were captured by Corsairs and the crews taken. In August 1625, a raiding party landed at Mounts Bay in Cornwall. The villagers saw the ships at anchor and fled for safety to a local church, but this was not enough to save them. The slavers dragged 60 people out of the church, loaded them onto their rowing boats, and took them on board the waiting ships. They all ended up in the slave markets of North Africa. On the 12th of that month, the mayor of Plymouth wrote to the Privy Council in London. He pleaded for assistance from the Navy because in 10 days, 27 ships had been taken, and all of the men on board, over 200 of them, had been made slaves. Now, as bad as it was to be in British waters, it was worse in southern Europe. Muslim raids on the northern shore of the Mediterranean were
it was worse in southern Europe? You mean the Barbary pirates that mostly operated out of Algeria? Wait a minute. Algeria, the country that's right here on the map you're showing? It was worse and closer to the country that a lot of the Barbary pirates were sailing from? No. Impossible. Crazy.
Most annual events of terror and pillage. In 1544, in the Bay of Naples, Algerians took 6,000 captives. 6,000 more Italians were taken during the sack of Vieste in Calabria. In 1566, they took 4,000 slaves in Granada, Spain, in a single raid. They described it as reigning Christians in Algiers. The list goes on. In 1617, 1,200 men in Madeira. In 1636, another 700 in Calabria, Italy. Then 1,000 more in 1639, and 4,000 more in 1644. In 1683, the French military attempted to free some of the slaves being held in Algiers. The Algerians didn't take kindly to it. Quote, infuriated at their helplessness in the face of such an attack, the Algerians decided to vent their anger upon those Frenchmen who were at their mercy, including Jean Lavache. Algiers had, at the time, the most powerful cannon in the whole of the Mediterranean. It weighed 12 tons. The 23-foot-long gun had a range of 3 miles. The unfortunate French consul was pushed partly into the barrel, the cannon then being discharged with a load of shrapnel, blowing him to pieces. The Algerians found 22 other Frenchmen and tied them to the muzzles of other guns and killed them the same way.
When it comes to protecting yourself and your family, it's better to be prepared. That's why.
That's why I, Matt Walsh, have prepared an array of different types of armor. Are you worried about being put into the barrel of a gigantic cannon and blasted away? Luckily, we have a set of armor directly for you. It is made of carbon fiber steel, the hardest substance known to man. And diamonds. Covered in diamonds. Raw diamonds. That's right. We think you deserve raw diamonds to keep you safe in case you're ever put inside of a cannon that can shoot up to 3 miles. This bad boy is certified for up to 4 miles of gun velocity. All right? If it goes anything less than 4 miles, you're gonna live. That's right. If these people in this story I just told you had been wearing this armor, they'd still be alive today. Several hundred years later. Let's go.
I'm a member of Ammo Squared. Ammo Squared lets you build an ammo reserve of your calibers steadily, month by month, without drama or excuses.
I'm good.
The options some are executed inside
Ammo Squared. Go to Ammo.
some are executed inside a cannon, spent the rest of their lives in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, which
Or they were ransomed and went back to their homes. Or they weren't sold to the Ottoman Empire because the Barbary pirates sold a lot of people and a lot of things to a lot of other folks.
incidentally is one of those colonial empires that no one on the left seems to mind, assuming.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about? This is like saying, oh, Rome is just one of those empires that people on the left never criticize. What are you talking about? Like, have you met historians? Have you? Well, probably not, considering your sources. But historians will like sit down and talk about the most minute details you can imagine. The stitching methods used on clothing at the time.
Matt Walsh Minecraft maxing by selling diamond armor.
Polybius, thank you for the $5 dono. Much appreciated. You know, historians will talk about the most minute type of shit. And it's wonderful. I love it. But, like, the idea that no one talks about the Ottoman Empire... I don't know. I used Yale as an example before. Just Ottoman... Here, do we have a Ottoman... Oh, hey, what's that? Oh, they have several courses on late Ottoman history at Yale right now. That's crazy. Oh, Yale College programs of study. Let's take a look at this. Oh, wow. Yale College of Programs of Study. There's the Ottoman courses on Ottoman history and literature. Course aims to introduce students to a variety of historical and literary Ottoman texts and documents from the 14th to 19th centuries. We read and analyze excerpts from original Ottoman texts such as chronicles, heroic narratives, advice books, physiognomy texts, travel accounts, hagiographical stories. Students participating in the course develop skills that enable them to read Ottoman Turkish texts and pursue independent work in Ottoman studies, because that's an entire area of research for historians. The idea that, like, people just don't care about the Ottoman Empire's history, like, that's a lot of bullshit.
They're even aware of it. One of the most shocking slave trades did not involve Europeans at all. It involved an Arab-run slave trade operation in East Africa, roughly around the same time as the Middle Passage was bringing slaves from places like Dahomey to Brazil. But unlike slaves arriving in the New World, Arabs frequently castrated male slaves to prevent them from breeding. The castration process was, in some cases, so brutal that 80 to 90% died during the operation. But it wasn't just castration leading to mass deaths. Conditions were so brutal that 3 out of 4 died before even getting to market. The East African slave trade included legendary traders.
Can we, just real quick, just out of curiosity,
died before even getting to market. The East African slave.
I can't help but notice that in this map of Africa that is on screen at the moment, you might not be able to tell here, but it's all zoomed in. But this red line goes directly through a bolded word here in the middle of this territory. I wonder what that word is. It looks like it starts with a G.
Died before even getting to market. The East.
Oh, it's German. It was a German colony.
African slave trade included legendary traders like the black ivory merchant Hamed bin Muhammad al-Murjbi, also known as Tipu Tip, who organized the removal of between 50,000 to 100,000 slaves from the Congo to move ivory to markets on the coast. Al-Murjbi earned his nickname Tipu Tip from the sounds his men's guns made during their raiding parties into the Congo. When he finally brought his slaves to the African coast with their ivory, they were then auctioned off to the highest bidder. So many slaves moved through East Africa that Zanzibar became the biggest slave market in the world. By some estimates, as
I'm gonna fucking lose it. I'm gonna fucking lose it. So for those of you who don't know much about the history of Congo, in the 1800s, it was purchased by King Leopold II. And there's a really great book that I constantly recommend if you want to have any context for what was happening during the scramble for Africa. Because King Leopold was the king of Belgium. And Belgium didn't really have a ton of colonies in Africa, but Leopold desperately wanted them to get involved, right? And what he did was he bought the Congo Free State outright. He personally owned the entire Congo. And interestingly enough, in this period of time, right, when he's talking about Tipu Tip, this occurred during King Leopold's reign. Okay? And one of the places, have you guys encountered the phrase Dr. Livingstone, I presume? I assume many of you have heard this famous line before. It was uttered by Henry Morton Stanley after he trekked through Africa in order to find David Livingstone. Henry Morton Stanley conducted that operation at the behest of King Leopold, and in the process of doing this, he personally started a location called Stanley Falls, or he named the location that anyway. Matt Walsh is talking about this guy, Tipu Tip, right? And the enslavement that was happening in Africa. A lot of the slaving that Tipu Tip was doing was in the Congo Free State, and personally helped Henry Morton Stanley, and then claimed for himself the Eastern Congo and declared himself the Sultan of Zanzibar during this time period. And he eventually became the governor of the Stanley Falls district in the Congo Free State. The folks that Tipu Tip was selling slaves to tended to be Belgian ivory traders. In case you had wanted to know what was going on here, again, Matt Walsh leaving out a lot of important context here. I think I got all of the relevant major details. Obviously, there's a whole lot more going on when talking about like the Belgian Congo era. I recommend all of you read King Leopold's Ghost. It is an incredibly important historical work, and we'll give you a lot of relevant background here. Is he basically who Kurtz is based on? Yes. I mean, Stanley is the one that Kurtz is based on, but yes.
As many as 17 million East Africans were sold into slavery over 1,300 years, dwarfing the transatlantic slave trade. Many of them worked spice fields and plantations in East Africa, and the practice wasn't abolished until 1909. Once again, because of colonizers, this time from Britain.
The colonizers were also the ones doing the slavery.
But the reality is that the East African slave trade, which exceeded the West African slave trade in its duration, barbarity, and quantity of slaves, has received relatively little attention from academics and journalists.
No, it has. You just didn't bother to look it up. You're just mad that this, I mean, frankly, you're not even mad about the information not being, like, included in, like, grade school history courses. You're mad that your butchering of the historical record is not the dominant narrative. That's what you're mad about. Matt Walsh.
That's because it's not a useful tool for a demoralization campaign against white Americans. White Americans, by the way, whose ancestors were enslaved as well.
Sometimes. Part of the reason why race is bullshit pseudoscience is, again, this idea like white people were enslaved too, and it's like, not my ancestors. What are you talking about? My ancestors, they were like wheat farmers in the Scandinavia region. Like, my ancestors not doing a whole lot of slaving, all right? The notable ancestors I know of is preacher, farmer, and maybe like a hot farmer lady who caught the eye of a Scandinavian king. Those are like the prominent members of my historical record, all right? And I'm pretty goddamn white. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but I'm pretty white. And it'd be something my 100-year-old grandma probably would have mentioned at some point.
On the morning of June 14th, 1786, Captain James Moore's family woke up on what seemed to be a normal day in Southwest Virginia. But as they left the family's cabin to tend to their farm animals, the fearful war whoop was heard, and a raiding party of Ohio Valley Shawnee Indians rode down a ridgeline and attacked them. Captain Moore was shot 7 times before being tomahawked and scalped. The Indians then murdered 3 of his children, leaving only his family members who were locked inside the cabin. Much like the Barbary pirates, the Indians broke into the house, shot the dogs, plundered and burned the home, killed the livestock, and took Moore's wife and surviving children captive. The raiding party stole horses and embarked on a journey to Detroit, which was then an open-air market for humans captured by Indians. To give you a sense of the savagery of the Indians, when one of the surviving sons, John, fell behind on the journey, An Indian split his head open with a tomahawk and then told John's mother what happened with her son's bloody scalp hanging in his waistband. They reached Detroit in December, where, in a drunken frolic, one of the surviving daughters, Mary Moore, was sold into slavery for a few gallons of rum to a man named Stogwell, who had been an active Tory during the war and had removed to Canada after it closed for fear of losing his life if he remained in the United States. 3 years later, she was rescued by her brother and returned to the United States. Stories like Mary Moore's were common in the early frontier period in America, and often the stories became nationwide bestsellers. The vast majority of white slaves in the United States were owned by fellow white.
Often, just as a important point, they often became bestsellers.
Somewhere between 60 and 70% of white immigrants to the American colonies arrived in bondage, often involuntarily. An estimated 350,000 arrived between 1620 and 1776, in numbers that likely far exceeded the number of black slaves who arrived in the 1600s. Mortality rates on the journey to the colonies often exceeded 20%. Many of them were legally classified as indentured servants under British law. Indentured servitude was, in theory, a contract entered between a poor person and a sponsor, in which the sponsor pays for the poor person's transit across the Atlantic in exchange for a set period of bondage. That, however, is the textbook definition. Reality was much harsher. In the early colonial period, there were not substantial differences between indentured servants and black slaves. Many were subjected to conditions of such brutality, duration, and heritability that historians increasingly regard slave as the more accurate term. There's no question that indentured servitude was slavery. Some indenture contracts literally use the term slave, and ads issued for runaway servants asked for them to be returned to their masters. Some of them were held in bondage for life. Many of them were sent here against their will. At the outbreak of the Revolution in 1776, more than 50,000 convicts were sent to the colonies as slave laborers. There were all sorts of sources of white slavery. They were the convicts, the urban poor, political prisoners, thieves, prostitutes, vagrants, prisoners of war, anyone designated undesirable by the British government. In the winter of 1650, 150 ragged Scottish prisoners of war arrived at Massachusetts Bay Colony, where they were sold as indentured laborers for 20 to 30 pounds each. And in colonial America, white and black slaves often bonded, according to NPR, which admits America's first slaves were white.
According to some African-American historians, there was no sign or little sign of racial tension between the English servants, which we reckon were slaves, and the African servants, who are also called servants. They were treated in much the same way for many decades. They complained together, they ran away together, they rebelled together.
George Washington himself had white slaves.
The beginning of your War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, there were ads in the Virginia Gazette for runaways, and I think that week there were something like 11 for white runaways and 3 for black runaways, and 2 of the 11 white runaways were being advertised by George Washington.
In early Virginia and Maryland, indentured servants, mostly English, Irish, and Scottish, did the same jobs that enslaved Africans would do in the 19th century, mostly tobacco farming. Conditions were so bad.
Yeah, okay, but there's a pretty big difference between indentured servitude and chattel slavery. This makes everything okay. The part of the issue here that Matt Walsh is really dancing around is that indentured servitude, by and large in the colonies, was done voluntarily, because poor people who couldn't find work and couldn't find labor to do in Europe found that they could sign a contract for indentured servitude as a means of paying for the passage to the colonies, because otherwise it was way too expensive to actually get to the American colonies. And yes, the work would be hard and dangerous and difficult, but also it offered a lot of opportunities beyond just the backbreaking labor, because the nature of an indentured servitude contract is that it is a contract. It has a limitation. It has an end. Typically, you worked for several years. And then you had options to extend that contract. You had, or you could escape it. Typically, indentured servitude included some level of building skill sets. It wasn't quite exactly the same as like becoming an apprentice, though you could. Essentially, Matt Walsh is trying to be like, oh, the convict labor. Convict labor was not large enough to satisfy the demand in the colonies for labor. Neither was the voluntary migration. So folks would then have to voluntary migration here, meaning like going and having the means to get here. You know, a lot of folks wanted to come here but did not have the means, and that is when contract labor, indentured servitude rose to prominence in the colonies. It's also worth mentioning, but that by the time the Revolutionary War happened, only around 2 to 3% of the population of the colonies was indentured servants. It was not common to be an indentured servant during the Revolutionary War period. It wasn't unheard of course. That's still 1%. That's still relatively high, but it's not the 25, 50% that Matt Walsh is portraying it here. I will also point out, as a point of comparison, the average population of the of enslaved people in the United States during the Revolutionary War was around 20%. So, just as a point of comparison, indentured servitude at the point of the Revolutionary War was like 1%. Slavery accounted for 20%. You would literally see 20 times more slaves than you would indentured servitude as servants. And I don't know to what degree you can trust a lot of the numbers he was giving. I do know that the colonies did accept a huge number, in some cases up to 50% of indentured servants. But again, that had to do with the capital incentive to do work in America versus the difficulty of accruing enough money to actually pay for passage. And indentured servitude provided an avenue for poor people to actually get here to do work. So
that 40 to 50% died before completing their terms. A 1671 report from Virginia Governor William Berkeley noted that the number of white slaves arriving vastly outnumbered black. Quote, "We suppose there come in of servants about 1,500, of which most are English, few Scotch, and fewer Irish, and not above 2 or 3 ships of Negroes in 7 years." He then went on to note that in the early years of the colony, 80% of servants did not survive the first year. But it wasn't just the slaves that were multiracial. It was the slaveholders too. At slavery's peak in 1860, thousands of slaves were owned by Choctaws, Cherokees, Creeks, and Chickasaw Indians. As Alan Taylor writes in the book American Colonies, the Iroquois were particularly brutal in this regard. In colonial America, the Iroquois would often subject captives, the ones they did not enslave, to ritualistic slaughter and cannibalism in which captives would be tied to the stake, stabbed, then prodded with hot pokers. Quote, "After the victim died, the women butchered his remains, cast them into cooking kettles, and served the stew to the entire village, so that all could be bound together in absorbing the captive's power." At the outbreak of the Civil War, one of South Carolina's...
Yeah, again, he's doing the thing of like, oh, scary indigenous people. Ooh. First of all, cannibalism, not unheard of in colonial America. The people who lived in colonial America frequently participated in not frequently, but occasionally participated in cannibalism, largely due to shortages and desperation. Jamestown is a notable example of this. And I will also say that there are accounts of cannibalism among indigenous people. The idea, though, I have been unconvinced. I'm not convinced, rather, that it was a widespread practice, as is alleged, largely due to the fact that historically, colonizing empires seek a kind of justification for the colonialism, kind of a white man's burden type of situation. And essentially narratives, especially best-selling narratives, white woman survival narratives that were popular in the colonies, say, tended to sensationalize experiences in order to sell well. And also, I don't know how accurate some of these accounts are, considering they also play heavily into justifying colonial expansion. Now, I'm not going to say it never happened, because historically, sometimes people eat people. That does happen. And sometimes it happens for ritual reasons, like, symbolically drinking the blood of Christ, or in some cases, if you believe in transubstantiation, literally drinking the blood of Christ. But other religions also have religious beliefs about consumption of, the dead. And this is not unique. So Catholics do cannibalism? Kinda. I mean, the transubstantiation, for those of you who are not religious brained, did not grow up religious or whatever, is essentially the idea that when you take communion, right, the wafer and the wine, the wafer is a portion of the body of Christ. When you eat it, the belief of transubstantiation is that a miracle occurs within your body, and the wafer, you are eating the flesh of Christ, and you are drinking the blood of Christ. And it might be in your mouth as a wafer, it might be in your mouth as wine, but as it goes into your body, a miracle occurs, and it becomes truly the flesh and blood of Christ. So that's, again, not an unheard of concept. Yes, also, it was very popular in the 1800s in Europe to eat mummies. Like, actually, like, unwrap and eat mummies taken from Egypt.
Wealthiest citizens was a planter and slaveholder named William Ellison. Census records show that at the outset of the Civil War, he owned 63 slaves, making him one of the biggest slave owners in the region. During the Civil War, he and his sons made substantial donations to the Confederate government, but what makes Allison remarkable is that he was a black man. In fact, he was a freed slave whose former master had given him the business skills he needed to become a successful cotton gin manufacturer. He was such a prominent member of South Carolina society that the Charleston Mercury newspaper noted that he was a large slaveholder and is much respected throughout the district for his integrity and general good character. When the American journalist and social critic Frederick Law Olmsted visited Mississippi in the early 1860s, he described meeting a black man who told him there were, quote, many free Negroes all about this region. Some were very rich. He pointed out to me 3 plantations within 20 miles owned by colored men. They bought black folks.
I just also want to point out, having, again, gone through college level like American history courses, they talk about the fact that, like, black people and indigenous people owned slaves sometimes. But again, the big question is, who owned most of the slaves? Who owned by far most of the slaves? In America, white folk. It's not that difficult.
Said, and had servants of their own. They were very bad masters, very hard and cruel. If he had got to be sold, he would like best to have an American master buy him. The French, black Creole masters were very severe, and they whipped their N-words most to death. They whipped the flesh off them. In total, an estimated 3,000 blacks owned roughly 20,000 slaves in 1860. And in some cases, black slaveholders purchased relatives and spouses philanthropically, rescuing them from other slaveholders. But according to the black historian Carter Godwin Woodson, they often simply bought and sold slaves like white traders. He even described one case in which, quote, a Negro shoemaker in Charleston, South Carolina purchased his wife for $700, but on finding her hard to please, he sold her a few months thereafter for $750. The 1860 census offers some context that's left out of the history textbooks in this country. That year, there were 3,953,760 slaves and 487,970 total free colored population. in the slave states in 1860. The reality is that a very small percentage of freed blacks and American Indians owned slaves, but the same is true for white Americans. In the 1860 census, at the very height of slavery, there were 393,975 slave owners in the U.S. out of a total population of over 31 million. That translates to about 1.2% of the population. The vast majority of American whites never owned any slaves. That's a critical point when in the context of modern calls for reparations.
No, it's not, actually. The math that Matt Walsh is doing here, I want to be clear. Sorry, I had to stretch. I want to be really clear, is deeply, deeply misleading. Largely because what he's talking about is the percentage of the entire population of the United States. That's not really useful if we're talking about the point of time in the United States history that is on the eve of the Civil War, right? When states were classified as free and slave states. Those were the two types of states. And so, if you are trying to argue, well, slave owners only made up 1.4% of the total US population, that's deeply misleading because we're not talking about the total US population. We're talking about the southern states. If you actually sit down and you do the math for southern states, well, you get a very different number than 1.4%. In fact, the number that you tend to get is around 20 to 25%, actually. Because in the South, around 25% of the population owned slaves. Also, can we just like take a quick gander at the fact that PolitiFact literally has a page on this on their website? If you Google the statistics that Matt Walsh is using, slaveholding by personal or family unit, 1860. So, percentage in slave states holding slaves. If you are talking about a household, around 25% of households had a slave. And, percentage of families owning slaves in the 1860 census. In Mississippi, it was almost 50%. Almost 1 in 2 households, or families rather, would have owned a slave. It would have been like having a dishwasher. That would be how common it would have been. So Matt Walsh is being incredibly dishonest here. And wow, they have the exact same claim he just made about 3,000 black people owned a total of 20,000 slaves. We are unable to find hard data to debunk or support this figure. The most solid data we found was published in an article in The Root by Henry Louis Gates Jr., a Harvard University historian. Gates cited research by Carter G. Woodson, an African-American historian who died in 1950. He found that in 1830, a total of 3,776 free Negroes owned 12,907 slaves. End quote. With 3 more decades of popular growth, it's plausible that the number of black-owned slaves could have grown by 20,000 to 20,000 by 1860, historians told us. I'd imagine the 20,000 figure quoted in the meme is probably not that far off from being true, said Junius Rodriguez, a Eureka College historian and author of Slavery in the United States, a social, political, and historical encyclopedia. But the 20,000 number is not necessarily as eye-popping as the meme makes it out to be. For starters, even if the number were accurate, it would still account for just a tiny percentage of all slaves held in the United States in 1860. Specifically, 0.5%. That runs contrary to the Post's framing. That's a very small number compared to Latin American or Caribbean societies, said Stephanie McCurry, a Columbia University historian and author of Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the Civil War South. In addition, the figure is almost certainly inflated by a legal quirk in most antebellum Southern states. It includes many owned family members whom they had purchased to become free, said Eric Foner, a Columbia University historian and the author of such books as The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln, and American Slavery. You could not free a slave in most southern states without sending them out of the state. Gates, writing in The Root, noted that the late historian Thomas J. Presley used Woodson's statistics for 1830 to determine that about 42% of these black slave owners owned just one slave. To Gates, this suggested that many, though hardly all, black slaveholders legally needed to own a family member, such as a wife or child. So, just so we're clear, when Matt Walsh is talking about all these black slave owners, it's because they needed to buy their wives and children back. And I'm not gonna lie, it kind of seems like Matt Walsh is getting his entire argument from this. At the peak of slavery in 1860, only 1.4% of Americans owned slaves. What your history books doesn't tell you is that 3,000 blacks owned a total of 20,000 slaves the same year.
As a rule, black slaves in the American South had a life expectancy of 40 years and an annual mortality rate of 3 to 5%. Their odds of getting married, having children, attaining freedom were dramatically higher than slaves in the Caribbean, Brazil, East Africa, or, God forbid, Dahomey.
Yeah, part of the problem here is that when you're talking about American chattel slavery, their children would have been born into slavery too. Like, the reason America had a larger slave population after, the slave trade was formally ended and it was illegal to continue bringing slaves to America, the reason the enslaved population continued to grow was because the children of enslaved people continued to be slaves. So, yeah, the mortality rate was lower because there was incentive to keep them alive so that they would have children, so that you would have more slaves. God, I'm gonna go Joker mode.
Slaves in the Caribbean lived in barracks. In the South, they had cabins. There's no doubt.
Yeah, no, they never had to double up in cabins. They never treated cabins like barracks in America.
Out that being a slave was a bad life, but if you were to be enslaved, it was better to be enslaved in the United States.
Ooh, even though my internet died on me, I'm back. ISP reset? Hell yeah, Coder Joe, you know what's up. Alright, let's finish this up. Matt Walsh being incredibly disingenuous.
Unlike other parts of the Americas where deaths exceeded births, the U.S. ended up with nearly 4 million slaves in 1860, despite only 400,000 arrivals.
Yeah. If you think about it, doesn't that sound like an unspeakable crime? Like, the 400,000 that were here, they had children, and their children's children had children, and like their children's children's children had children, and all of those generations were enslaved. Like, that enslavement was the reason their population grew, because they were viewed as investment property. It's not because people were being nice to them to be nice. They were doing it because of capitalism, man. If the people were interested in being nice to them, they would have not enslaved them in the first place. I'm sorry, that's really fucked. It's super fucked.
Now, one reason for the better conditions could be incentives. With the import ban, slave owners' best source of slaves was high birth rates.
Yes, they were literally plantations dedicated towards breeding slaves. It was, again, an inevitable outcome of a system where humans are treated as property. And I do not want to elaborate more on that.
Buying more was really expensive. Typical price for an able-bodied male field hand in New Orleans in 1860 was about $2,000. And if you track inflation based on the price of gold, that'd be over $100,000 today. For this reason, There are well-documented cases of slaveholders preferring to use less valuable, lower-class whites for dangerous tasks.
Yeah, there are some cases of that, but also in a lot of cases, you would just use your older, weaker, or more or less desirable slaves to do those tasks instead, because they were literally your property and you wouldn't be then held legally responsible if something happened to them. God, I hate this. I hate this so much. This guy's such an odious piece of trash.
In 1800, there was not a single country on earth that had abolished slavery by law. Not one.
I don't know that that's true. I mean, you can definitely find examples of, for example, Athens abolished slavery. Rome, at various points, abolished slavery, but certain kinds of slavery. It's kind of like how we abolished slavery in the United States, but we left a massive caveat for imprisoned people to be used as slaves. It's kind of like that. Like, you had different types of abolishment of slavery prior to the 1800s. Noteworthy, there was a Chinese emperor who abolished slavery. There was a number of laws passed in a number... Like, basically the idea that, like, well, prior to 1800, no nations had attempted to abolish slavery. That's just not true. Like, it has been a long and historical process. A lot of people at various times in the past have banned slavery. Venice famously banned slavery in, like, around 1000 AD. Like, oftentimes localized. In 1171, all English slaves were freed in Ireland. I don't know, like, there's like a whole lot of examples that one can draw on. I mean, France even abolished slavery in 1315 under Louis X. Like, I don't know, like, it kind of seems to me like if you were interested in, like, talking about this in more depth, you could find a lot to talk about. But let's keep going.
By 1900, Britain, France, the United States, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal had all outlawed it. Every single abolition took place in societies under European control or heavy European pressure. In a perfect Orwellian twist of irony, it turns out white men are the heroes of the slavery story. It was the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron that freed hundreds of thousands of African slaves, all done at the expense of the British taxpayer. It was the nearly 400,000 Union soldiers who died in the American Civil War, and the entirely white Congress and white legislatures that passed the 13th Amendment ending slavery.
I gotta be honest, right? If you live in a house and if you lived in a house and you found out that the person who previously lived in that house kept someone chained up in the basement, and then you found out that not only had that person kept someone chained up in the basement, but their father before them had kept someone chained up in the basement, and their father before them had kept someone chained up in the basement, and they all looked like you, I don't think you then get, like, a pat on the back for, like, being, like, after, I don't know, 10 years, you're like, hey, maybe we should let this guy out of the basement. You know? Like, you then live in the house for 10 years with this person locked up in the basement. You don't then get, like, a pat on the back for, like, letting them loose. I mean, like, yeah, it's good that it happened, but, like, you don't get to be, like, cool, you know? Like, it's not like, you did the right thing begrudgingly after a way too much time passed. And also, let's not forget Abraham Lincoln famously said that if he could have ended the Civil War without freeing the slaves, he would have.
The legacy of slavery is a permanent, unpayable debt that justifies racial redistribution in perpetuity.
It's not a permanent unpayable debt. But you have to take into account the fact that by and large, African Americans in this country were treated as private property for 400 years. And it turns out that when you treat people as private property and deny them the ability to transfer generational wealth, and then once they are free, you institute a set of laws that discriminate against them economically and politically, and then you firebomb any of their businesses that are doing well, and then it turns out after a huge upheaval of social change during which you still continue to discriminate against where African American people can live, it turns out there's still an existing economic burden that continues to exist despite the fact that slavery was abolished, right? Like, despite all of the social change, the economic burden still is there because my ancestors were able to transfer economic wealth between generations. Not every family in America has been able to do that. So to say, oh, it's an unpayable debt. No, it's a very payable debt. It's a trackable debt. We actually know the kinds of economic damages that were done. And rather than address that, what has been kind of the consensus up to this point, or not consensus, but like operable guideline, has been, well, let's get the social reforms and the economic reforms will follow. But that hasn't necessarily been the case. Because at every turn, an attempt to implement those social reforms has been gutted by the fact that economic institutional support is constantly being gutted by the folks who would have a happy return to Jim Crow. You know, the Southern segregationists. You know, the kinds of folks that are the reason we have Southern Baptists instead of just Baptists.
Then literally every ethnic group on the planet owes every other one. The descendants of the Kingdom of Dahomey, which sold millions of their fellow Africans, would owe reparations to the descendants of their victims. The Arab world would owe West Africa and Europe. The Ottomans would owe the Balkans. The Irish would owe the English, and the English would owe the Irish. The list is endless because...
Yeah, but we're not talking about every single conflict that has ever existed in human history. We're talking about very specifically a specific group of people that was specifically treated a certain way, and the economic burdens that were placed upon them still continue to exist. The question isn't, well, we feel guilty and we want to stop feeling guilty. Don't we, fellow whites? Well, geez, we better give them a whole lot of money so we can stop feeling guilty. Like, that's not the issue. The issue is what will alleviate this economic burden and help everyone in the process. You can in fact just say, hey, maybe we should build better and more infrastructure in areas that have been historically redlined and uninvested in, specifically because it was home to many African Americans. Hey, maybe we should be focusing on helping these areas of town that are considered the bad areas of town and turning them into good areas of town by investing in our civic infrastructure, by having jobs programs, by having after-school programs, by, in actually investing in the infrastructure that makes day-to-day life possible and hopeful.
Slavery is the norm, not America's unique shame. But only one civilization.
No, the form of slavery in America is America's unique shame. That's the argument. The argument isn't that slavery as a vague concept is unique to America. It is that the specific form of slavery that was codified in America and perpetuated in America is uniquely American and bad. Like, God, for someone who goes on and on about Western civilization and white culture and American culture, he seems to be real slippery when it comes to what the implications would be if American slavery were a part of American culture, huh? Weird.
Ever decided the guilt outweighed the profit and bled itself dry to end it? That's the real story they don't teach. What do Snow White, Cinderella, and smallpox blankets have in common? They're all fairy tales.
You already played this. We're not going to watch it again. Well, I hope I did a good enough job pushing back on this bullshit. I know it was a little bit of a rough ride. We had a few Google debunkers. We had a few rabbit holes we had to go down.
Google debunkers.
But I think it was worthwhile. I think we learned a lot. I think we got something out of it. I don't think it was a total loss. I think it was fun to shit on this. I guess I have to call him a man. And we maybe had some laughs along the way. I don't know. That being said, Matt Walsh is not a historian, and you shouldn't take him seriously. And you should instead indulge your curiosity and learn about the stories we talked about. Go find primary sources. Go find some well-researched historical nonfiction reads, because honestly, that can be some of the best stuff you can get your hands on. Again, highly recommend King Leopold's Ghost. It is incredible how often that is an important keystone work. And yeah, I guess I'll say please check all that out. And let me know what you thought about all this in the comments. Do you want me to do more of these from Matt Walsh? Let me know. I guess if you guys like it, I'll do more. And I'll be a little bit better prepared next time, I think. But all that being said, let me know in the comments. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Get organized, folks. Join your local Dems, join your local DSA, and last but not least, especially if you want to piss off Matt Walsh, check out ImogeneOlivia.com. Gender euphoric lingerie designed from the ground up for trans femmes. Tested with cis men, cis women, non-binary folks. People love it. It's super comfortable. I'm wearing it right now. And also, there should be a link for it down in the doobly-doo. It is non-tucking lingerie. Very sexy, very comfy. Check it out. Let's keep on going.
Riverboat Jack is coming to town. All the viewers gather round. Twitch and YouTube and swishy streams. All that content is bursting the seams. Politics, dating, plenty more. Your sense of fashion you'll adore. So grab your stuff and hop aboard. We're going straight to Jack's